Good day, fellow patrons, friends of APAVM, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third and last lecture in the Road to Rome and the Vatican Lecture Series. My name is Thomas Ng, and I'm privileged to be your moderator today. In the first two lectures, we have covered Florence and Siena with Elaine Ruffalo and Fabrizio Nivola. For those of us who were in the APVM trips last year and this year, it triggers fond memories of the beauty, the fascination, the grandeur, and the camaraderie that we enjoyed. This last lecture has something even more special, as it will cover a destination which is upcoming for us, Naples. We did catch a glimpse of what to expect when we were in Malta earlier this year, learning about the life of Caravaggio. If I may just give a quick reminder that your camera has been turned off and sound muted for this webinar. We encourage you to post your questions in the QA box, and we will attempt to have all your questions addressed today. Should we run out of time, we will attend to any remaining questions via email. As always, we are very privileged to have excellent resource speakers for all APAVM events, and today is no exception. Dr. Ross King is a best-selling author and a prolific speaker and lecturer. Many of his literary works have international recognition and awards. Brunelleschi's Dome, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, Leonardo and the Last Supper, and Mad Enchantment on Claude Monet, just to name a few. Ross serves on the Council of Academic Advisors for Friends of Florence and lectures regularly in the Smithsonian, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Frick Collection, the National Gallery of Art, and the Telfair Museums. Ross is originally from Canada, where he earned his PhD from York University in Toronto. He moved to England as a postdoctoral research fellow at University College in London, and he currently lives near Oxford in a little town called Woodstock, I believe, with his wife, Melanie. So, as promised, today we will immerse ourselves into the life of Caravaggio in his search for redemption in Naples, Sicily, and Malta. Over to you, Ross.
Hello, thank you. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for staying up late. I realize it's very late in Melbourne at present. Thanks also to Ben for the invitation to come and speak with you. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about Caravaggio, who is one of the great painters. And at this time of year, when we think of the Christian story, we, I think, have to give credit to Caravaggio as one of the greatest visual interpreters of it, someone who gave some of the most impactful images of the Christian story in the history of art. And so what I want to do is give a kind of introduction to him and his art and this search for redemption that is in the title, and why exactly he needed to somehow redeem himself, either through art or through acts of mercy and things such as that. So I want to begin with, I'll come back to this rather arresting image at the end of the talk, which is a self-portrait of him. Artistic self-portraits are always very interesting to look at because you get a kind of presentation of how the painter thinks of him or herself. And there's a very specific story behind this one. In any case, the story I want to tell starts early in 1607, very possibly late in 1606. The difficulty with Caravaggio's life is we can't always fix moments in his life all that clearly, apart from some of them that I'll talk about, which we know about because they ended up in the legal records. But because of the fact that he spent time as a fugitive and virtually undercover, some of his whereabouts and whenabouts aren't exactly known. In any case, around the turn of 1607, when he was in his mid to late 30s, he arrived as a wanted man, a fugitive in Naples. And just to introduce him, you might know that his name was actually Michelangelo Merisi, and he was known as Il Caravaggio after the village that he came from in northern Italy. We'll have a look at it in a couple of minutes. But he was, by 1607, he was probably the most famous and certainly controversial painter in Italy. Really, he had a Europe-wide reputation at this point. But when he left Rome to go to Naples, he was really on the run from the law. So he arrived in Naples in southern Italy, the Kingdom of Naples. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. He arrived there, but he was a long way from home when he went there because he was from Caravaggio, which you can see here in the north of Italy, very close to Milan. And he was born there in 1573. September 1573, he was named Michelangelo, not after Michelangelo Buonarroti, but after the Archangel Michael, whose feast day it was that he was born on. So he was actually named in honor of the Archangel and not in honor of the artist. And he, not a lot is known about his early life. He was the son of a mason, someone who built walls for the local lord. And Caravaggio himself may have been destined for that kind of career, but his father passed away when Caravaggio was young, and he went to went to Milan to become a painter. And he apprenticed there with someone who had been a student of Titian, the great Venetian painter, or at least someone who claimed to have been a student of Titian. And Caravaggio worked with him for probably would have entered the studio around the age of 13 or 14 and worked perhaps until he was about 21 years old, at which point in the early 1590s, again, we don't know exactly when this happened, but he went as a young man to Rome in probably 1592 or at the latest 1593. Rome at this point was the artistic capital of Europe because of the fact that for really the previous century, most of the previous century, some of the great patrons of art and architecture had been the popes and also possibly even more importantly, the cardinals. Rome was also a much more populous city than it had been throughout the Middle Ages, when the population fell as low as maybe 25 or 30,000 people. By this time, by the 1590s, it had a population of 120,000 people, making it one of the larger, by no means the largest, but one of the larger cities in Italy at this point, and indeed in Europe at this point. And so Caravaggio fetched up there as a young man with, at this point, no real reputation, and it appears no real connections or anything like that. He really did just sort of pitch up in Rome and began painting and trying to make his way in the world. And initially, he found great difficulty. As one of his biographers, there were a series of biographies of him written in the decades after his death. And one biographer who did actually know him described how at this point Caravaggio found himself without money and poorly dressed. And so he did have difficulty selling his paintings and initially finding patrons. And he appears to have fallen ill at one point. We're told that Caravaggio was hospitalized for a period of time when he fell ill. And this sick little Bacchus, Bacchino Malato, it's called, is a self-portrait, and he does look ill in it. He looks as though perhaps he has jaundice or something of that nature, and is unwell. And so he suffered from poverty and ill health during this period in his early 20s. But fortunately for him, a couple of people came to the rescue. His talent was noticed quite quickly by a number of very powerful people in Rome who were not only wealthy, but were also great connoisseurs. First of all, perhaps a cardinal, Francesco Maria del Monte, who actually took him into his house. I'll show you the house in a couple of minutes. And his friend, the cardinal's friend, Vincenzo Giustiniani, who was a wealthy banker, in fact, probably the wealthiest man in Rome at this time. And they began buying works from him and also commissioning work from him. And they both built up very impressive Caravaggio collections. Cardinal Del Monte owned at least 10 paintings, and Giustiniani even more. He had 14 or 15 paintings by Caravaggio, both of them purchasing these over the course of the 15 years or so that Caravaggio worked in Rome. And crucially, they also got him work. They got him commissions, important commissions with ecclesiastical institutions. So they were crucial to his health, well-being, and reputation in Rome in the late 1490s and the 1590s and early 1600s. Also, I mean, perhaps even more politically powerful than either of them was Scipione Borghese, who was the nephew of the reigning Pope, Paul V. Paul was a Borghese, and Scipione was was Paul's mother's son, whom he allowed to use the surname Borghese. And so he became the papal nephew and had incredible powers of patronage and influence in Rome at this time. And he, like Giustiniani, and Cardinal Del Monte, loved Caravaggio's work and competed to buy it, and really supported his career through these years in which he was becoming known and coveted as one of the great painters in Italy, great painters in Europe at this time. And Caravaggio, for a few years at least, lived in luxury in the residence of Cardinal Del Monte, which is the Palazzo Madama, which, if you've been to Rome, you will no doubt have walked past it. It's heavily guarded because it is the seat of today. It's the seat of the Italian Senate. So he lived in this sort of luxury for a few years at least, being paid room and board by Cardinal Del Monte, who gave him, as I've said, lots of work to do. And so the works that he was doing at this time were private commissions initially. Works that they would hang in their private rooms, private galleries. Works such as this one's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Musicians are sometimes called the Concert of Youths, which he did for Giustiniani. And one of the things I'll point out is we have this bare back, or at least a bared shoulder, and I'm going to show you just a small fraction of Caravaggio's paintings. But in many of them, you'll see the back of a character turned towards us. And in many cases, if someone's back is turned to you in a painting or in real life, they're in some ways out of the picture. But what Caravaggio does is uses this very dramatically, because his characters who have their backs turned to us are often performing important actions and really bring us into the paintings. And so this is one of the ones he painted for Giustiniani, and this is one he did for Cardinal Del Monte, just one of the many he did for him, the lute player. So it's another musical scene. It's what's called a genre portrait of a young man playing the lute. And it's interesting because of the fact that in it we can see Caravaggio, who's still a relatively young man at this point, developing the style that's going to make him very famous. What he does is uses a hidden light source. Very rarely is there a light in the painting itself, or a light that we could identify with, for example, the sun. He always has this hidden light source, which he's going to use in his religious pictures, which he will move on to very soon after this. He will use it in his religious pictures as a sign of divine revelation or ecstasy, or just a sign of the divinity. And so we have this hidden light source hitting this figure and illuminating him. And what you'll see he begins to do in the decade after this is to darken and deepen his shadows and increase the intensity of the light and give us those wonderful, bold contrasts of light and dark. But one of the other things that he became known for was the brilliance of his still life painting. Still life was not a genre at this point. It was really going to be developed only in the decades afterwards by some of the great Dutch painters of the Dutch Golden Age. But Caravaggio really beats them to it and gives us, for example, the flowers, the fruit, or the violin with the bow and the music, which themselves are beautiful still lifes working their way into this portrait. And Caravaggio is credited with giving history's first independent still life painting. This was done, no one's exactly sure when, probably about 1600 in Rome, as a still life painting of a basket of fruit. But it's very interesting for a variety of reasons. One of which is, of course, that it is just a basket of fruit with nothing else in it. And so it stands independently. But we also have, if you look very closely at this, I'm not sure how well you can see it on your screens, you can see that the apple is worm-eaten, and these leaves are very crisp and dry, and there's probably a fungus on the leaf of the pear, and this pear here has been infected with something likewise, and this leaf is shriveled. So it's a basket of fruit, but it's a basket of fruit that has passed its sell-by date, we might say, and the fruit is beginning to go off. And you can give a kind of symbolic interpretation of it, perhaps, that he is showing the transience of all things, the way of all flesh and fruit. But he is also, I think, doing what he always claimed to be doing in his art, which is painting nature, painting things naturally, warts, or in this case, wormholes and all. It's also interesting because he breaks the space between us as a viewer and the painting by having the basket project over the edge. And when you look at some of the paintings that I'm going to be showing you, you'll see that the way in which Caravaggio will have figures almost coming out of the frames and into our space. He was creating what art historians call coextensive space, where he brings us as the viewer into it. And that obviously gives his works a much, much greater impact than if it is merely distanced from us. And he said something interesting about this painting. Giustiniani, when he was watching Caravaggio painted, claims that Caravaggio said that it is every bit as difficult to paint a piece of fruit as it is to paint a human being. A saint or an angel, for example. And Caravaggio's critics, of whom we'll see there were many, later used this against him because he was sort of upending the hierarchy of art and saying that inanimate objects, the props for paintings, were every bit as important as the protagonists of the paintings, the figures themselves. And this is what Caravaggio was doing throughout his artistic career, was really fighting against the current of the prevailing notions of art. He really was revolutionary in his painting. And you can see very clearly the way he's both painted it very realistically, and yet with all of the flaws that are in the fruit. Now, he first came to, we could say, worldwide prominence around about 1600, 1601, when Cardinal Del Monte got him a job just down the street, or really around the corner from the Palazzo Madama. So here we are hovering over Rome, looking down at Piazza Navona, with the great Gian Lorenzo Bernini sculpture just hidden here by the parapet. But Palazzo Madama is here, and just around the corner, San Luigi dei Francesi, the national church of the French. Someone else was supposed to decorate a chapel, but was unable to do it. And Cardinal Del Monte pulled strings and got the job for Caravaggio. The job was decorating the Contarelli Chapel with 3 paintings. And so these 3 paintings, this is such a marvelous space in Rome to go into the church and see this, because you get not 1, but 3 Caravaggio paintings and 3 spectacular paintings, which really fell on Rome, fell on the artistic world like a thunderbolt when these were unveiled. And one of the things that you can see him doing is using the natural light of the chapel to act as a kind of illumination for his paintings, as a kind of source of illumination. What these do is tell the story of St. Matthew. We have the calling of St. Matthew, we have St. Matthew and the angel, Matthew inspired to write the gospel. And then on the right-hand side, we have the execution, the martyrdom of St. Matthew. So if we look at the one on the left, the calling of St. Matthew, you can see they see this light, this supernatural light coming in. We have Christ with St. Peter at his side, pointing at St. Matthew, who after all is a tax collector. And so Christ comes and just gesticulates towards him. And you can see the hand of Christ here might remind you of a different hand, maybe the most famous hand in the history of art, the hand of God or the hand of Adam in Michelangelo's creation of Adam. And it's interesting that Michelangelo, Il Caravaggio, became known as the second Michelangelo. They shared the name and they also shared the sort of massive reputation. And Caravaggio was seen as a kind of second coming of that artistic brilliance. And he might be playing with that a bit here with that hand, which is straight off the vault of the Sistine Chapel. But it's interesting because of the fact we have this divine light coming in from the upper right-hand corner on this side and lighting the scene. And you can see that the shadows have now deepened. The upper left, Caravaggio will often leave a space like this blank in the painting to highlight everything else that's going on in it. And then we have these pointing hands pointing at St. Matthew. Although it has to be said, it's somewhat ambiguous who exactly Matthew is. Is he this figure here, as it might seem from some of the other paintings that Caravaggio did of him in the Contarelli Chapel, because he does appear to be an older man, but there is speculation that this might be Matthew here, with his collecting his tax. And so this is another thing about Caravaggio's paintings. He often gives us a kind of ambiguity and gives us some guesswork as we look at one of his paintings. One of the other things that Caravaggio starts doing and really does here for the first time in his work is to give modern costume. So here we see a biblical scene from, let's say, 25 AD, and yet all of the characters are dressed in the costume of Rome, circa 1600. So Caravaggio is like a director who is doing a modern dress Hamlet or something like that, and dressing them in modern costume. And he's doing it that for the same reason that the director of Hamlet will use modern costume. It's to make people think about the story occurring in their own time and have a kind of intimacy, therefore, with it. So this is one of the ways that Caravaggio grabs us by the lapels and drags us into the painting, because we can, if we were back in 1600, see ourselves and our friends in his paintings, perhaps quite literally, because in many cases, Caravaggio dragged people off the street and used him as his models. He didn't use pattern books or anything like that. He posed his models, and in this sort of a light, he was like a theatrical director in this way as well. He posed them together and then painted directly onto his canvas without making a series of preparatory sketches. So he approached things very much as a director or producer of a kind of theatrical spectacle. And we can see that Caravaggio is probably the most theatrical painter, certainly by this time, that there had ever been. And he continues this on the right wall of the Contarelli Chapel with the martyrdom of St. Matthew, where we see Matthew about to get the chop. And the light, of course, comes from the upper left, in this case, from the window. And this figure here, if you stand in the chapel, almost comes into our space. And again, it's one of these figures whose backs we see, someone who is facing the painting very much in the same way that we are, and witnessing, watching what's occurring just as we are. And so he's a kind of stand-in for us. And you notice the way in which Caravaggio has lit him. The shoulder is hit by the light, but of course the back is not. And so we have these deep, deep shadows that fall throughout the painting, which is called chiaroscuro, which Caravaggio is probably the most adept, prolific, and possibly original practitioner of in art. It simply means light or clear and dark. And that's really what his painting from this point, from about the year 1600, becomes about: watching light fall almost glaringly on top of figures whose other side then is cloaked in darkness. So we have this very dramatic lighting in his paintings, which again are something that he creates an extremely dramatic scene through the use of light, and also through having all of his figures very close to the picture plane, and all of them more or less on the same point in the picture plane. He doesn't have a lot of recessional space. One of the things he was not interested in was the use of perspective and showing a distant prospect behind the figures. His figures are often backed up by a wall. They're often backed up against the wall, often in a row or in a line, with the dramatic action taking place. And so that's what we see happening here. And as I say, he became famous for this work, became one of the most famous painters in Europe at this time, but also controversial, because some of his works were rejected. Not everyone liked this incredibly realistic style that he had adopted. They wanted idealized figures. If they saw saints and people in the paintings, they wanted to see heavenly beings who had come down to earth, or beatific figures. But what Caravaggio gave instead were often the poor and the dirty of Rome that he would find outside in the streets. And one of his most controversial paintings, one that was actually rejected by the people for whom it was painted, was his scene of the death of the Virgin. And the story goes, and it's repeated by the biographers who came along very shortly after his death, and so I think we have to credit it, that this image of Mary was that of first of all, a prostitute, secondly, possibly a dead prostitute, and thirdly, someone who had drowned, a drowning victim. And so to many people, it seemed unworthy of the Virgin Mary, clearly unworthy of the Queen of Heaven to be depicted in this manner. So obviously dead, with a sort of swollen belly, with swollen ankles, with twisted toes, and sort of spread-eagled on the bed. I mean, this is a scene of death. But I think Caravaggio was trying to make the viewers realize what it would have been like to be at the deathbed of the Virgin, rather than having a kind of idealized, mythologized view of what her death would have been like. In any case, as I said, this was rejected, and Caravaggio attracted as many critics as he did adherents. He had very powerful backers, but he also had some very powerful people who did not like his art. He was accused of imitating common and vulgar things, seeking out filth and deformity. And was said he did not know how to get out of the cellars. It was said that he worked in a cellar, in a basement, because it was believed that the light was the light from a window on the ground floor that came down into the basement. And that may well have been the truth. And that he certainly seems to have had a window high above in his studio that he used to get that lighting effect that he wanted. And one of the most powerful people in Italy, in Rome, someone from Milan who might have been a supporter of Caravaggio, was Federico Borromeo, who said, speaking of Caravaggio, contaminated men must not deal with divine things, having made themselves unworthy, full of vices and faults as they are. It is hard to see how they can infuse images with that piety and religion which they do not possess. And I'm not entirely sure it's clear that Caravaggio didn't possess piety and religion in his own way, because of the fact that he inhabited these scenes he painted and knew the Christian story so intimately, and I think very passionately, that I think it's not true that he was irreligious. However, what is Borromeo talking about? What are these vices and faults? And now we get into why Caravaggio has to flee, because, as I said, Caravaggio, we can track his movements in some ways, certainly his actions, through the legal record in Rome, where he made frequent appearances in the the documents. He had a long rap sheet. I won't go through this, but he wounded a guard with a sword. He assaulted a waiter. The waiter had served him artichokes, and Caravaggio asked him which are fried in butter and which are in olive oil, and the waiter said, "Eat them and you'll find out." And that was enough for Caravaggio to assault him. He was jailed for throwing stones at the police. Not a good idea. He insulted a corporal who asked to see his license to carry a sword. He was jailed for offending two women. He consorted with prostitutes. He wounded a notary with his sword at one point. They had a long kind of litigation, which Caravaggio ultimately concluded, as he did so often and so regrettably, with violence. And then he threw rocks against the window of his landlady. There is some suggestion that what she objected to is that he was doing something with the studio to get a better entry of light into it, so perhaps he made a hole in the ceiling or something of that sort. In any case, he fell out with her. And then, of course, the inevitable happens on the 29th of May, 1606, where Caravaggio kills someone who had been his friend and who was, in fact, his tennis partner, Ranuccio Tomasoni. The two of them had apparently, according to one of the biographers, a dispute over a foul call in a game of tennis. They began hitting each other with their rackets. And Caravaggio, who always carried a sword, it was said that when he finished painting, he would go out on the town swaggering with his sword on his hip. And he pulled out his sword and slashed poor Ranuccio with it in the midst of this brawl. And Ranuccio bled to death. And that's when then Caravaggio has to flee, and he goes as a fugitive, fleeing papal jurisdiction. And so where can he go to get away from the Pope and the Pope's men? And that is the Kingdom of Naples, which is really a vassal state of the Kingdom of Spain. The King of Spain at this time is Philip III, and he ruled Naples through a viceroy. And so at this point, Caravaggio fetches up in this large and vibrant city. Naples at this time was double the size of Rome, twice the size. It had increased dramatically in population over the previous century as people came in from the countryside outside of Naples looking for work. By this point, the Spaniards had really been in control of the Kingdom of Naples for the better part of a century. And they, especially under a viceroy in the middle of the 1550s, Pedro de Toledo, had built all sorts of fortifications to make and made the harbor one of the best in southern Italy, and made it a kind of bastion against attacks from other powers, be they Ottoman, be they Barbary pirates, people like that. And so Naples at this time is a huge, vibrant, fairly prosperous city in which Caravaggio is known, and his reputation preceded him before he fetched up there. These are some of the new constructions around the time that he came in. The Castel Nuovo, the new castle which had been built. This mole was also built in the previous couple of decades, and of course the Viceroy's Palace. There were lots of Spanish soldiers in Naples at this time, and this is the Quartieri Spagnoli, and this area, you'll probably go into it, those of you going to Naples later or in 2024, one of the most colorful, formerly quite dangerous, but now quite cleaned up and but still very characterful parts of Naples. And that's where the Spanish troops were quartered during the 1500 and then throughout the 1600s. And so this is the city into which Caravaggio comes. And as I say, his reputation preceded him because he is immediately taken into the employ of the most powerful man in the Kingdom of Naples at this point. And that's the Viceroy, who is the man handpicked by the King of Spain to rule over Naples, and often rule with an iron fist. And so this man, the Duke of Benevente, has tremendous powers of patronage. and he takes, and you can see he gets the very best to paint his portrait. El Greco did this this portrait of him, and so he's the viceroy during the time that Caravaggio pitches up there, and he commissions a work from him. And it is the Crucifixion of St. Andrew, which is now in Cleveland, and it's one of Caravaggio's great paintings. We have two backs turned to us in this, one of which is the Duke of Benevente himself, the viceroy, who appears in self-portrait in it. But I think we can really appreciate the Caravaggio's commitment to realism in this work because of the sort of attention to the structural members of the human form, both in the guy who's trying to untie untie Andrew. The story is that Andrew is crucified. Caravaggio shows him on a Latin cross, not the X-shaped cross that he's often, but not always, portrayed on. But Andrew preached from the cross, and so they decided to take him down. But this guy's arms will become paralyzed, and he will not be able to remove Andrew from the cross, and he will continue preaching until his death. And we can see the sort of death is going to come upon him very soon. But I like this figure here of the woman looking up, and she clearly has a goiter on her throat, in her neck, as she's gazing up, and we can see her jugular also. And so Caravaggio, once again, even now in Naples, is using real people in his art. And you can see here, this figure has an open mouth as if he's shouting either approbation of what Andrew is saying or doing, or perhaps protest. And so you see a lot of open mouths and a lot of speech, a lot of yelling in Caravaggio's paintings, because he wanted us to, I think, hear those sounds or imagine those sounds as we looked at his paintings. And the star of this obviously is Andrew himself, with this incredible detail of his anatomy, and with the flushed face, the flushed features, the veins and muscles in the neck, and the eyes which are half closed, and the mouth which is slackening them. He's been preaching for days by this time from the cross, and he's showing the dreadful wear and tear this has taken on him. And so Caravaggio, despite being a fugitive, is wanted by connoisseurs and patrons every bit as much as he's wanted by the authorities. But what he really wants is a kind of redemption. He wants to go back to Rome, and I think get back into the good graces of Pope Paul V. And he, I think, is hoping that someone as powerful as the Viceroy of Naples or some of the other supporters who rallied around him at this point. One of the things we mustn't think is that Caravaggio, despite being an illegal outcast and having this rather gruesome reputation for violence, did not alienate many of the people like Giustiniani or Borghese, Scipione Borghese, or Cardinal Del Monte, who seem to have supported him throughout. And there were other followers and very powerful people, members of the Colonna family also, who protected him. And I think he was, if you were one of them, you probably received almost on a weekly basis some sort of appeal from Caravaggio for a way of getting him back into the good graces, maybe getting his conviction overturned, etc. But one of the things he does in Naples, which I think is indicative of his hope for redemption and his quest for mercy, for a papal pardon, which is really what he wanted, is what he wanted legally, is a work that he did, his great masterpiece in Naples, that is still in Naples, is a work that's in a building very close to the Cathedral of Naples that we see here, with the Chapel of St. Januarius, the great saint of Naples, right here. And it's just a few steps away. And it's a building that was very new at the time that Caravaggio came to work there for a group that was very new, that had just been instituted. This is the Piemonte della Misericordia, the Pious Mountain of Mercy. This was a group of wealthy aristocrats, of laymen in Naples who'd come together a couple of years earlier as a kind of charitable group who wanted to heal the sick. They wanted to provide a kind of social welfare system to the poor people of the poor and sick of Naples. And so they wanted, to give them housing, to give them food, to give them clothing, possibly education, things such as that. And these are kind of ministries that live on today through private charities and things such as that. So these are pious laymen who are doing good works in Naples, and certainly doing very good work. And so what Caravaggio does for them, what they want from him, is an image, one of the great images of charity, of Christian charity, and that is the 7 works or 7 acts of mercy that he painted for the altarpiece of this circular chapel that we see in the Piemonte. It was painted for this location, and like his paintings in the Contarelli Chapel, fortunately is still there. So we have the great opportunity in Naples of seeing a work by Caravaggio painted for the location in which it still sits. And it's a remarkable work in which Caravaggio, as one of his biographers said, he used all the talents of his brush in this work. He has 13 figures crammed together. It's a big painting, but nevertheless, he has 13 figures in it, who are sort of, in the case of these ones, tumbling through space, but occupying not very much space. This is a street corner in, we could imagine, Naples. This is something, not unlike, minus the angels, perhaps, not unlike what you might have seen if you stepped out the door of Caravaggio's studio in Naples. And so it's called the 7 works or 7 acts of mercy. And some of you might know what they are. They're found, the description of them in Matthew 25, where Christ is talking about how, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. And so these are there are actually only 6 of them mentioned in that Matthew. That burying the dead was one that was added in medieval times. But these are the works of mercy: to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, give shelter to travelers, or we might think of give shelter to the homeless, tend to the sick, visit the imprisoned. All works of mercy that charities today are obviously still involved with. Things that society in the 21st century is still as much in need of as it was in Naples in 1607, 1608. When Caravaggio was there. And so he does something quite different by putting everything into one scene. It was a popular piece to do in the course of the Middle Ages because after all, it's a work about Christian charity and works of mercy. And what was normally done is you would show each one of those very separately. So you would have, and here Christ is the protagonist, feeding people, giving drink to the thirsty, visiting the sick, burying the dead, and so forth. Occasionally, people would make it into a single scene and put it into an altarpiece, as, for example, this anonymous painting now in Rotterdam, but they would use up a fair bit of space. We have, for example, in the background, someone on his sick bed being visited. We have people visiting, people in the distance, people in the tower, going up into the tower to visit someone who's imprisoned there, and then travelers on their way to be sheltered, being welcomed into the hospice. And then in the very background, we have the burial of the dead with someone with his spade or his shovel making a grave. And so you have all of this space, whereas Caravaggio puts everything, as I say, into a street corner, into something like, I'm not sure how we would measure this, maybe 3 square meters or something like that, a very small space. And so he has someone drinking, it appears, the jawbone of an ass, like Samson did. We have someone giving shelter here. This man has a shell in his cap, so we know he's a pilgrim and he's traveling. we have this figure here, this very wealthy figure, both clothing the naked and probably also visiting him, paying attention to him in his state of ill health. We have someone who is visiting someone in prison. There are prison bars here, and also feeding the hungry, giving him sustenance. I'll come to this in a minute because very famous story here. And then someone burying the dead, of which we can see only the feet. But the whole thing begins with where charity begins. Charity begins with Christ and the Virgin Mary. Up here we have a kind of image of the Madonna della Misericordia, the Madonna of Mercy, the wings of whom, I mean, she's escorted by angels, and the wings really form a kind of protective garment or protective arms over everything that's happening. But typical of Caravaggio, these are tumbling angels, this one of whom is really supporting them in space with his hand placed like this. And we can see that, again, a wonderful Caravaggio effect of this supernatural light coming in from the upper right and actually casting the shadow of wings on the wall on the right. And then as we descend, we can see in close-up some of these people that Caravaggio has bunched together, all virtually on the same plane of the painting because of this very confined space that he gives us. The traveler here is being given directions here. Perhaps he's the proprietor, is saying that just go over here and you'll get your shelter. And this man, often identified as Saint Louis of Toulouse, is giving his garment to this man down here. And yet again, we see the back of a figure who is looking up and who, as I say, in some ways is a representation of us as we look up at the painting and turn and in many ways see what he sees from that slightly less elevated viewpoint. This image might strike you as somewhat strange, the young woman offering her breast to the old man, but it's from a famous story initially in Greek and then adopted by Romans as an ultimate act of charity, because Pero goes to prison and his daughter visits him and is condemned to death by starvation. And his daughter Kimon comes to visit him and feeds him from her breast. And this was seen as the ultimate act of charity and of filial piety, obviously. And then we have this image of the burial of the dead, where the feet of the deceased we can see as he's being borne away, being taken away for inhumation. And so Caravaggio would have stayed in Naples, perhaps, because he was finding very powerful patrons and supporters there, were it not for his dream of becoming a knight. He wanted to become a Knight of Malta. He wanted to join what's officially known as the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, named after the hospital constructed in Jerusalem about 1049, 1050 by people from Amalfi, who then developed into, and so it treated and looked after and offered shelter for pilgrims who went to Rome at that time during the Crusades then that began in the late 11th century. And the Knights of Malta appear to have been founded about 1099, around the time that the Crusaders went over the walls of Jerusalem for the first time. And they became a kind of militarized religious order who offered military protection, not just health and welfare to pilgrims to Rome. They ultimately were in Rhodes. They were the Knight of Rhodes until in the 1520s they were ousted by the armies of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan, and they then went and were given the island of Malta, which from 1530 onwards they used as their operational base. It housed their fleet of galleys, and they launched their defensive or sometimes offensive, if need be, campaigns from there. Caravaggio, for some reason, wanted to become a Knight of Malta. But again, this might be part of his search for redemption. He's looking for mercy, he's asking the Pope to be merciful by doing the 7 acts of mercy. He's maybe taking a more active role in his exoneration by joining the Knights of Malta. And he actually needed to get a papal pardon in order to join the Knights, because you couldn't become a Knight of Malta if you'd killed someone. And the Pope therefore said, I'll lift that dispensation, or I'll lift that that qualification when it crossed his desk. Caravaggio's name was not on the document, so he didn't know he was offering, absolving Caravaggio of that crime so that he could become a Knight of Malta. But I think that gave Caravaggio encouragement that he was going to be able to get his murder overturned by joining the Knights. And he had connections really throughout his career with men who were the members of the Knights of Malta, including the son of the man for whom his father worked. I said his father worked as a muratore, a mason, a wall builder for the local lord in Caravaggio, and that was a man named the Marchese Colonna. And so the Colonna family, the Colonna son, Sforza Colonna, became a kind of protector of Caravaggio, and he was very high up in the Knights of Malta. And I think Caravaggio thought, I will join the Knights of Malta and become a kind of pious and I mean, you can see this mixture of piety and violence in Caravaggio's paintings, and we're now going to see it kind of come to fruition with this dream he has of becoming a knight. And so in the summer of 1607, he leaves with Sforza Colonna on a ship that belonged to the Knights of Malta, and he goes to the island of Malta, or the islands, because you can see Gozo here as well, the small island, and he goes to Malta to begin a kind of redemption, a search for patrons, yes, but also a search for a kind of possibly even a spiritual refuge, and possibly atoning for his sins. And so he comes to Valletta, and once again, immediately has the most powerful person on the island take him under his wing. If in Naples, he was immediately contracted by the Viceroy of Naples, in Valletta, he immediately became the court painter to Alof de Vignacourt, who was the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. This is the most powerful man in the order, and indeed, through the Knights of Malta, one of the most powerful people in Europe. And so Caravaggio becomes his court painter. De Vignacourt gets the pardon for him from the Pope, or the kind of dispensation that allows him to become a Knight of Malta. And indeed he does. He serves his year-long apprenticeship or probationary period, and then in the summer of 1608 becomes a Knight of Malta. But in the meantime, of course, he does paintings in Valletta, which I see I've misspelled here, unfortunately. There are two L's, but he does, this is in the St. John's Co-Cathedral in Malta. Those of you who went to Malta last year, I'm sure, saw it. It's one of the most arresting paintings that you can ever see, is beautifully displayed in the Co-Cathedral. And I think it is worthy of what was said about it by one of the great Italian art historians and the great expert on Caravaggio, Roberto Longhi, who called it, writing in the 1950s, he said it's the painting of the century, i.e. the painting of the 1600s, and which is no faint praise when you consider that coming along a few decades hence, we're going to have Nicolas Poussin and Velasquez and Rembrandt. But I think, you could argue that all of them would struggle to keep pace with Caravaggio here, who gives us this wonderful, horrific scene, but portrayed once again with his unerring ability to capture the essence of a story through gesture, lighting, and expression. St. John the Baptist has been executed. His throat has been cut, and now the executioner has his knife out. He has just removed it from the sheath, and he's going to remove the head, which is going to be put in this basket, as this attendant is telling us. And the girl is stooping already, waiting for the head to go into the basket. She's dressed very modestly, and so this is probably not Salome. This is just a waiting woman. We have several non-participants who witness this, the horror of the old lady, or the sort of shock. and then the two prisoners, because this obviously takes place in a prison courtyard. And we see Caravaggio here with these figures pressed up against the wall of the prison. As I said, he's not concerned with perspective. He's concerned with architectural and a kind of monumental architectural form, but not with giving us deep recessionary space. He wants us to focus very closely on these figures that he brings very close to the picture plane and groups very tightly together, such that all of these five figures are overlapping each other, and then slightly detached are these figures here. And so it's once again, Caravaggio has brought all of his talents into the painting. It was done for, effectively the Knights of Malta, and it is believed, I think, legitimately, plausibly, that this was a kind of tribute he was making to the Knights of Malta. You usually had to make a financial donation, but most knights came from very wealthy families. Caravaggio didn't have a lot of money in the way that they did, and so it's believed that this was his a kind of diploma piece that he donated to the Knights of Malta to commemorate and legitimize his ascent into the order, which took place in July of 1608. And he signed the work, as you can see at the bottom, the only work he ever signed. And he signed it in an interesting way. It's F. Michelan. And so the F obviously stands for Frau, or brother. All the knights were brothers, and so he sort of proudly signed it, but yet signed it gruesomely in the blood of Saint John the Baptist. And so it's his announcement that he is a Knight of Malta. But tragically, and I'll come to the conclusion fairly quickly now, is we're going to. Can you see me? Have I lost it? I got a. Are we back? Sorry, I got some irritating notification and I clicked on it. Anyway, I think we're back. The image that we have of Caravaggio of his violence sadly continues. And a month after being inducted into the order, he got into a brawl, an ill-judged dispute, according to one of his biographers, with another Knight of Malta in the house of the organist for the cathedral, and he was thrown into prison, where the Knights of Malta who misbehaved were imprisoned in September, and spent September of 1608 incarcerated there. But dramatically, everything in Caravaggio's life is so dramatic. He escaped from this fortress. He obviously had help. He had people high up who were assisting him, but we're told that he escaped at night using a rope ladder and then made his way to Sicily. And he was fleeing the knights. He went to Syracuse, first of all, and began doing his paintings there for religious organizations. So Caravaggio, whatever stains there were on his escutcheon, and he was going to be defrocked. On December the 1st, 1608, the Knights of Malta gathered in front of the painting in the oratory where his work was hung, the place it was painted for, this painting of St. John the Baptist. They gathered there and in absentia defrocked him. And he was no longer a Knight of Malta. So that dream died, and once again he became a fugitive, traveling around Sicily. He went to a number of cities, first of all to Syracuse, where he painted the burial of St. Lucy, in which he begins to develop a new style, which sadly he did not live long enough to develop further, where we see a mass of figures arranged in this sort of declining line, in this diagonal line, all of them packed very tightly together against this wall in a kind of catacomb where St. Lucy, who we see sprawled dead, is going to be buried by these grave diggers. And again, Caravaggio is upending the hierarchy of art because St. Lucy is prone here, and the grave diggers are the ones who are forefronted. Even the bishop giving his blessing is really blotted out by the other characters. But Caravaggio's style here is really interesting because he is letting the ground show through the painting, and he isn't covering everything. He had the leisure to do it. It's not an unfinished work. And his patrons were actually happy with it. And it still is in the place for which it was painted for. And so Caravaggio does this work, a number of other works in Sicily. And when he learns or believes that he's going to be pardoned by the Pope, he gets word that the Duke of Gonzaga from northern Italy is appealing to the Pope and that the pardon is imminent. And so he returns to Naples, from where he believes he's going to leave fairly soon and go to Rome and have his papal pardon and resume his career there with the cloud removed from him. And one of his last works, possibly the last work he ever painted, is this one, David holding the head of Goliath, now in the Gallery Borghese in Rome, where he shows David, a very uncertain and maybe reticent looking David, holding the head of Goliath. And so we see this very close up. This is one of the things that Caravaggio does, is he has these extreme close-ups in his paintings. The head of Goliath is presented to us, and it's really being presented to Pope Paul V, because this is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. And so he has gruesomely depicted himself. So he's in many ways giving a figural representation of his own head in lieu of the actual forfeit he was going to have to make if he was caught and executed. He would have been executed if he had been caught by the Pope and the Pope's men. In any case, sadly, his life ended very soon afterwards, because he did set off for Rome. He was attacked in Naples, probably by Knights of Malta, people working with them. His face was slashed. It was said he was barely recognizable, but he believed that Rome was going to be a safer place now for him. And so he left, departed for Rome, was mistakenly arrested en route, thrown into jail for 2 days, where he probably contracted some sort of illness that killed him a couple of days after that in Port Hercule, the port of Hercules, where he died supposedly on the beach, or perhaps in some sort of infirmary. In any case, he died relatively young, when he still sadly had much to offer. As I say, he split the art world almost roughly in two, but the great painters who come later in the 1600s were to pay attention to the lessons he taught. The two great painters of the middle part of that century, Velasquez and Rembrandt, both took their lessons from Caravaggio. Anyway, I'll end at that point, because I think I've gone on close to an hour, at least almost. So I'm using up time that you might have for any questions that you want to give to me.
Thank you, Ross. What a fascinating lecture. Thank you so much. We do have quite a number of questions that have popped up, so I'm going to try to go through all of them. The first couple are from Bruce Hemmingson. I think his opening comment was that by all accounts, Caravaggio had a violent temper. I think you kind of had told us about this, right? So he's kind of pretty much.
Yes. I mean, I haven't speculated on the reasons for this violence, but he was. It seems he could fly. He had anger management issues, I suppose we would say today. Yeah. He was. I mean, the best description we had, the best two descriptions we have of events that he got into trouble for were the waiter. We know exactly what happened. It was a dispute over artichokes, and he took offense at what the Roman waiter had said to him, and therefore attacked him. And then again with Ranuccio, I mean, people try to say that it was maybe a dispute over a woman and that Caravaggio attacked him because of that, but that none of that appears in the court documentation. And what the biographers say, some of whom I say, as I said, knew him, say that it was simply a dispute over tennis. And I'm sure anyone who has played tennis knows that foul calls can often cause dispute. We see it at Wimbledon, for example, every year, and smashed tennis rackets. And it appears to have escalated rapidly from that kind of everyday dispute into extreme violence. And the question is why Caravaggio reacted like that. Did he have some sort of, I mean, was there an illness, a mental illness, for example, that troubled him? Otherwise, he seems to have been, he could apply himself to his work and was productive throughout his life. there are no long periods in which he had. So, for example, I don't think we can say that he was bipolar because he did not have depressive periods or down periods. He seemed to work constantly, but he was just someone who hung out in many ways with a bad crowd. He had his band of bravi, and they would go around Rome or again Naples, in many ways looking for trouble.
Okay, the other question that Bruce had was about the female painter inspired by Caravaggio, who in turn inspired
Yes,
Caravaggio in his artwork. You didn't talk about that, did you?
sure. No, I didn't. And a very good question. Thank you. Um, the female painter and one of the great female painters that was inspired by him was Artemisia Gentileschi. She was just over 20 years younger, and so probably had little or no contact with him. But she worked in Naples. She grew up in Tuscany, in Florence, and her father was a painter who did know Caravaggio. Her father was Orazio Gentileschi, and Orazio really became the first of the what would be called the Caravaggisti, the followers of Caravaggio. Caravaggio had not just patrons, wealthy men, cardinals, and bankers and ecclesiastics who wanted his work. He also had young painters who came to Rome or Naples specifically to see his work because his work had electrified young painters who thought, here's a new and exciting way of painting. And one of those people was Orazio Gentileschi. And so he came, and then just a generation or so later, a decade or so after Caravaggio's death, Artemisia comes into her own as a painter. And growing up, she spent really the better part of her career in Naples. She spent, I think, at least 20 years in Naples. And so she would have seen things like the seven works of mercy repeatedly, I'm sure, and at close hand, works like that. And so through a kind of osmosis, this entered her way of painting. And so that you can argue that she, as well as Rembrandt and Velasquez, are sort of the children of Caravaggio.
Okay, next question I'd like to bring up is from William Chang. Caravaggio's erratic behavior and questionable sexuality drew early criticism, but his artwork is influenced in gay culture, especially in the late American 20th century. We're not going to comment on that.
Yes, Caravaggio's sexuality is a matter of some dispute and debate because he certainly was, at the very least, bisexual. And I'm using a term that they would not have had at that time. But he certainly had female sexual partners, often, it seems, prostitutes. He never married. And a lot of his early work, especially, is undeniably homoerotic. The lute players and the concert of use that I showed you are a kind of case in point. And so it is, I think, an open question of how much of that is Caravaggio and how much of that is his patrons, because it's almost certainly the case that Cardinal Del Monte was what we would call homosexual. Again, they did not have that term, but Cardinal Del Monte had young men, often very young men, in his entourage. Giustiniani possibly also. And Scipione Borghese, again, certainly was, by our terminology and our understanding, homosexual. And so when he was doing work for them, his works were undeniably homoerotic. And so the question is, was he just doing that sort of work to cater to the kind of art they wanted on their walls, or was this something that he did because he himself enjoyed it? When he got his ecclesiastical patrons, one of the things it said is Caravaggio maybe was not homosexual because of the fact that once he got out of the orbit, that Roman orbit of, that trilogy of Giustiniani, Del Monte, and Borghese, those figures disappear from his paintings. But of course, they disappear because he has ecclesiastical patrons at that point, and so there isn't license to do that kind of thing. And so it's difficult to know what his sexuality was. And I see there's also a question about someone has asked about what he died from, because he died, as Bruce points out, at a relatively young age. And did he die from syphilis is a question. And one of the things I've wondered, but have never, Caravaggio seems to be one of the few artists in history post 1500 who is not accused of having syphilis. I've never seen reference that his we could almost say insanity was caused by a syphilitic infection, and then that his death. I think he showed no other symptoms of it in the course of his life, so maybe we can rule that out. A sword wound is an interesting speculation that Bruce has, because of the fact that he was brutally attacked in Naples and almost killed, and it could have been the after effects of that. I think he possibly contracted something in prison, or equally likely, what the story that we're told is that the ship has sailed with his belongings, with his paintings, and so he chases the ship and tries to catch up with it, and finally gets to Port Ercole, and collapses on the beach. And so it's a hot July day in southern Italy, and so he may well have died from a heat stroke or something like that. Or Bruce, we might be able to say all of the above for what killed him. His death, in many ways, is overdetermined, and he certainly feared for his life. I mean, it is perhaps a miracle he lived that long, because his biographer says, in a very telling phrase, speaking of Caravaggio in Malta, he says, fear hunted him from place to place. And so Caravaggio believed the Knights of Malta were after him. And of all of the organizations you did not want to fall afoul of, the Knights were probably what would be top of the list, one of the top of the list. And so in Sicily, he definitely lived in fear for his life. And I think he was desperate to get back to Rome, where perhaps he could have a kind of protection from the Pope, because of if Paul V pardoned him, the Knights would have no cause really to come after him and kill him, as it appears they had attempted to do in Naples shortly before his death.
Okay, next a question from Francis Tan. Italy has had many artistic genius, certainly in the Renaissance period. Is there something unique or special that can be said about the Italian environmental factors that nurtured the artistic geniuses, such as society's keen appreciation of the arts and culture, ready patronages, popular thing to do, and availability of good finance?
A very good question. Thank you for that, Francis. And if I had, well, first of all, I would say again, you could say all of the above. But secondly, I would say if I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be in my little shed here in rural Oxfordshire. I would be holding a prestigious chair at an elite university. In fact, no one, I think it can't really be explained that easily how it happened. But certainly what was happening from, you could say, going back as far as 1300 and Giotto up to Caravaggio, you have this unbroken succession of artistic geniuses in painting, in altarpieces, as well as frescoes, in architecture, and sculpture. And so I think one of the key things, I think maybe you hit on it with the last couple of things you mentioned, the idea of patronage and good finances, because Italy, of course, was the center of the papacy at that point. And so not in the 13 and 1400s, but certainly by the 1500s, and then by Caravaggio's time, the church is the major power in Europe commissioning works of art. Previous to that, in the 1400s, for example, the main ones doing it were wealthy individuals and institutions of lay people, like the charities in Florence, the Silk Guild, or the guilds in Florence, like the Silk Guild, or the charitable foundations that they established, and wealthy bankers like the Medici, people like that. But by the 1500s, and especially after the Council of Trent, which ended in the middle part of the 1500s, the real Counter-Reformation fight back against Lutheranism what you get then is the church taking a very, very active interest in the kind of art that is going to be on the altarpieces and on the walls and the vaults of churches. And there is all sorts of money on the table. And so if you are a young kid from an obscure village in northern Italy, and you pitch up in Rome as, a 21-year-old with quite a lot of talent, you are going to be spotted by, first of all, Justiniani, but then ultimately by popes and cardinals and people like that.
Thanks, Ross. One other question from Andrew. He'd like you to compare and contrast Caravaggio's journey through Malta, Sicily, and Naples with St. Paul, who apparently did the same route. Is that right?
Yes, yes, very good point. Yes, yes, Saint Paul went. He wrote his letters to the Romans, and repeatedly in them would greet the Romans by name. And at one point, he, I think, lists something like 20 different names of people, which gives us an indication of who whenever he was doing this in the 50s AD, gives us an insight into, in the, say, 2 decades after the crucifixion of Christ, who the people are in Rome who are followers of Christ. And the interesting thing is that the names are both traditionally Hebrew names, Greek names, and also Latin names. So we get this image of a kind of polyglot Christian community, and also crucially female names. He greets women in Rome, and what he always says to them is he wants to come to Rome and see them, and so finally he does. He gets his opportunity, rather like Caravaggio, because of a legal dispute. It is the right and prerogative of Paul, as a Roman citizen, which he was, to appeal to the authority of the Emperor Nero, on the charge of stirring up sedition in Judea, as he had supposedly been doing. And so he made his journey across the Med, and made the various stops along the way. And then ultimately his penultimate stop was just outside of Rome, to the south, at the Four Taverns, where a huge group of people from Rome came to greet him. Interestingly, it'd be interesting to know if Caravaggio had any kind of identification with St. Paul because of this. His great painting of St. Paul is in Santa Maria del Popolo, the conversion of St. Paul, where sadly, those of you who are going to Rome next year might not be able to see that painting because the entire church is under refurbishment. I was just in Rome a month ago, and so was not able to go and pay my homage to Caravaggio there. But his great painting of St. Paul comes before Caravaggio made his journey, the sort of journey that Paul made. And so I can't say that there's any identification between Caravaggio and Paul. But both of them, I think we can see a kind of parallel in their life, that they are spreading the gospel. Paul through his preaching, Caravaggio through his painting, and both are seeking a kind of redemption. Both are seeking legal exoneration for things that they have done, or have, in the case of Paul, supposedly have done. So thank you. Great question. And thank you for posing that. And for food for further thought, I will say.
Okay, we are running a bit late, but we have one last question. Can you talk about the lost or found masterpieces of Caravaggio? Are there any well-known ones that have been destroyed?
Yes, it's very sad. There were a lot of Caravaggio paintings out there because he was very prolific. There were lots of copies of them made very soon after Caravaggio had finished them. They're not meant to be forgeries or anything like that. There were simply people loved the paintings and wanted to make copies of them. And so we have quite a few of those, but we have lost ones. Many of them have been lost, and we don't know how they've disappeared. Just somehow over time, they vanish, because difficult as it is for us to imagine, for centuries, Caravaggio was not a name to conjure with in art, because he's really seen as the first of the great Baroque painters. And the Baroque was the enemy of classicism. And in the 18th century, classicism returned with a vengeance to art. So Caravaggio was sort of looked down at. Some of those criticisms that were made of Caravaggio in his own lifetime that I read to you, people would have made those same criticisms in the 18 and even the 1900s. And so Caravaggio's reputation dipped at that time. And as I say, he really only returned to his rightful prominence in many ways in the 1950s with Roberto Longhi, the great Italian art historian, who brought together a great collection of his paintings for an exhibition in Milan. And so many of them are lost. And I think the most tragic of it, the only one I'll mention because we do know a little bit about it, is the one from that was in Palermo, that the nativity scene that was stolen. Since it was in Palermo, the mafia are the main suspects in it. It was apparently stolen to order, and was kept in very bad condition. And it was stolen, I believe, in 1970s, but I might be wrong about that. But it was in such bad condition by the time the man who asked for it to be stolen, when he saw it, whoever he was, some mafia don perhaps, wanted to gloat over it in private in his James Bond style lair. When he saw it, he apparently burst into tears because it was in such dreadful condition. But 50 plus years later, it has not resurfaced, and I suspect it will not, sadly. And if it does, it won't be in any kind of condition, or will be in urgent need of a kind of restoration. So there are sad stories. There are Caravaggios out there, which is maybe enthralling, that if you have an aged aunt in Naples or Malta, maybe you should check in her attic to see if she has a rolled up canvas that might be a Caravaggio painting.
Yes, we can only hope. We can only hope. So once again, Ross, we cannot thank you enough for taking the time and sharing with us not just your knowledge and understanding of the topic, but also your passion. Thank you so much for that.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks.
Patrons, friends of APVM, ladies and gentlemen, again, this completes our Road to Rome and the Vatican Lecture series. I hope you have all enjoyed this, and it has enticed you to sign up for the next APAVM trip in September 2024. Naples beckons. For those who are still not yet a member of the APAVM, I hope that this lecture series has motivated you to become a patron. As you can see, the fees are rather affordable, value for money, and you'll be supporting a good cause whilst enjoying all the benefits of being a patron. As we bring this to a close, I would like to thank again all our speakers for this lecture series, Elaine Ruffalo, Fabrizio Nevola, and of course, Dr. Ross King, as well as my fellow moderators, Bruce Hemmingson and William Chang. And we should not forget to thank those behind the scenes. Our chapter administrators, Lulu, Isabella, and Irene, have worked tirelessly to keep us all in check and in step over these past few months. And if I may say so, I am immensely proud of our support team from Janashtim, who have managed all the creative work and technical support in promoting and running this series. Last but not least, thank you all for the continued support and patronage of the APAVM and for your participation in our lecture series. We look forward to seeing you at our local events in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Manila, and please do look out for announcements on our lecture series for 2024. A very Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy, and prosperous New Year to each and every one of you. Bye. Thank you again, Ross.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.